divorce papers were served on a Tuesday, in the front hallway of the Ashworth family home in Oakville, while the woman who would replace her stood close enough that Isadora could smell her perfume. That detail always stayed with her afterward. Not the papers themselves, not the words her husband said, not even his mother standing at the top of the staircase watching with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a long time for this moment. What Isadora Ashworth, 38-year-old co-founder of Meridian Health Partners, remembered most was the perfume. Something expensive and unfamiliar, worn by a woman who clearly had no trouble wearing things that belonged to someone else. His name was Clifford Ashworth, 44, third-generation owner of Ashworth Medical Supply, a company his grandfather had built out of a garage in Burlington, and his father had grown into a regional institution. Clifford was tall, broad-shouldered, and deeply accustomed to being agreed with. He had a way of standing in a room that suggested he believed the room had been built for him specifically. He had married Isadora Crane 11 years earlier, and for a long time she had found that quality admirable. Confidence, she'd called it then. The woman beside him in the hallway was Tamsin Keir, 31, a project consultant who had come into Clifford's orbit about 18 months earlier through a trade conference in Toronto. She wore a cream blazer and looked like someone who had rehearsed this moment at least once. She held Clifford's arm lightly, the way you hold something you've already decided is yours. Clifford's mother, Josephine Ashworth, 69, did not come downstairs. She simply stood on the landing and observed, and that was enough. "You've had the papers since Thursday," Clifford said. "It wasn't a question. I'm just asking you to sign them." Isadora looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Tamsin. Then she picked up her coat from the chair by the door, folded it over her arm, and said she would have her lawyer review them. She left the house that afternoon carrying a bag she had packed 3 days earlier, which told you everything you needed to know about how long she had seen this coming. What nobody in that hallway understood, what Clifford, in particular, had never bothered to find out, was what Isadora had been doing for the last 4 years. They had met in their late 20s at a fundraiser for St. Joseph's Hospital in Hamilton. Isadora was working in healthcare consulting at the time, doing operational restructuring for mid-sized regional clinics. Clifford found her sharp and interesting, and he would later admit to friends, a little intimidating, which he found attractive. They married in 2015 at a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. Josephine wore a hat to the wedding that could have been described as a statement. The early years were, by most accounts, fine. Isadora continued her consulting work. Clifford ran Ashworth Medical Supply with the same self-assurance he brought to everything. They bought the house in Oakville. They talked about children intermittently, the way couples do when neither person wants to admit the conversation has a deadline. Josephine visited on long weekends and had opinions about the curtains. It was around year 5 that things began to shift. Not dramatically, that would come later, but in the way that a house settles on its foundation, small movements that nobody notices until the cracks appear in the walls. Clifford had begun spending more time at the office. Isadora had begun spending more time thinking. She was good at her work, genuinely good, the kind of good that meant clients asked for her by name and then recommended her to 3 other people. She had spent years helping other companies become more efficient, more financially sound, better structured, and she had begun, quietly, to wonder why she wasn't building something for herself. In 2021, she started Meridian Health Partners out of a rented office above a tea shop on Lakeshore Road. The company's purpose, in plain terms, was to acquire struggling independent medical supply companies, restructure their operations, and either revitalize them or fold them into a larger network. It was exactly the kind of work she had been doing for other people for a decade, except that now the equity was hers. She did not tell Clifford everything, not because she was hiding it from him, exactly, but because every time she tried to explain it, he would nod and then change the subject to something happening at Ashworth Medical Supply. She came to understand that her work in his mind was interesting the way a hobby is interesting. Something she was doing until something more important came along. She had the company registered under a numbered holding company. This was standard practice in her field. It protected the acquiring entity's identity during due diligence and prevented target companies from raising their prices artificially when they knew who was coming. It was not a secret. It was just business. By late 2023, Meridian had completed 4 acquisitions in Ontario and was looking at its 5th. Ashworth Medical Supply had not been doing well for approximately 3 years. Clifford knew this, though he did not like to say it plainly. The company had overexpanded during the pandemic, taken on contracts it couldn't consistently fulfill, and burned through its line of credit trying to close the gap. 2 of its largest hospital clients had quietly shifted their business elsewhere. The margins had been thinning since 2022, and nobody at Ashworth, including Clifford, had made the changes needed to stop the bleeding. Isadora knew this too. She had watched the financial indicators the way you watch the sky before a storm. Not with pleasure, but with the recognition that what was coming was going to come regardless of what anyone felt about it. In the fall of 2023, she also found out about Tamsin. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. A forwarded calendar invite sent to the wrong email address, a hotel in Toronto, a name she didn't recognize. She did not confront Clifford immediately. Instead, she sat with the information for several weeks, turned it over, and came to a conclusion that surprised even her. She was not heartbroken. She was tired. She was tired in the particular way that arrives when you realize you have been accommodating someone else's comfort for so long that you have lost track of your own. She called her lawyer, a woman named Bridget, whom she had known since law school, and asked a number of very specific questions. Then she called her financial advisor, a man named Gerald, who had been with her since before Meridian existed, and asked a different set of questions. Then she went back to work. The offer came to Ashworth Medical Supply in February 2024 through a numbered company called 7841493 Ontario Inc., which was a subsidiary of Meridian Health Partners, which was wholly owned by Isadora Crane. Her legal name, not Ashworth, because she had never formally changed it on the business documents. She had meant to. She just hadn't gotten around to it. The offer was fair. It was not generous, because the company was not in a position that warranted generosity, but it was structured in a way that protected the employees and maintained the contracts. Isadora had worked carefully on that part. Whatever she thought about Clifford, she had no interest in punishing the people who had worked at Ashworth Medical Supply for 20 years. Clifford received the offer, brought it to his board of 3 people, 2 of whom were his cousins, and called in his accountant to review the terms. The accountant, a careful man named Morris, who had been doing Ashworth's books for 15 years, told Clifford plainly that the offer was approximately 20% more than he could expect to get on the open market given the current debt load. Clifford pushed back. He wanted to know who was buying, which was a reasonable question, and one that 7841493 Ontario Inc. was under no obligation to answer in detail at that stage of the process. The offer documents listed an acquisition agent named Renwick, who communicated professionally and without elaboration. What Clifford did not do was hire an independent investigator, or ask his own lawyer to research the numbered company thoroughly, or request a second opinion from someone outside his existing circle. He accepted the offer in principle in March, having convinced himself he was in control of the negotiation because Clifford Ashworth was not someone who easily accepted the possibility that someone else might know more than him. The due diligence process began. The financials were opened. The staff was interviewed. Everything Isadora already knew was confirmed, and a few things she hadn't known were uncovered. A deferred maintenance bill on one of the warehouses, an employment dispute that had been quietly settled, a loyalty rebate arrangement with one supplier that had never been documented properly. Through all of this, Renwick communicated on behalf of the acquiring party, and Clifford never pushed hard enough to find out who Renwick actually represented. In April, Clifford told Isadora he wanted to move forward with the divorce. They were in the kitchen at the time. He had clearly rehearsed what he was going to say, and she had clearly been expecting it, and neither of them raised their voice. Josephine, who had driven up from Burlington the previous evening, was in the living room pretending to read a magazine. "I think this has run its course," Clifford said. Isadora asked him to clarify which part he meant exactly. He said he thought they both knew, and she said she would like him to say it plainly, and he said he had feelings for someone else, and that their marriage had been struggling for some time, and that he thought it was kinder to acknowledge it directly. She poured herself a second cup of coffee and told him she would need to speak to her lawyer before she signed anything. Josephine came into the kitchen then, and the conversation ended. The formal signing of the acquisition was scheduled for June 3rd at a downtown Toronto law office. Clifford had agreed to this date, had confirmed the appointment, had arranged for his own counsel to be present. He arrived with his cousin Harik, who served informally as a business advisor, and his lawyer, a man named Oswald from a firm in Mississauga. Renwick met them in the lobby and walked them to the conference room. The acquisition team was already seated at the long table when they arrived. 3 people, a junior associate, a financial analyst, and the principal of the acquiring company. Clifford came through the door, straightened his jacket, looked at the table, and stopped moving. Isadora Crane, 38, sat at the far end of the conference table with a folder open in front of her and a glass of water at her right hand. She did not stand up when he entered. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had already done a great deal of thinking. and had arrived at a place of considerable clarity. Clifford did not say anything for a long moment. Harik looked at Oswald. Oswald looked at his briefcase. It was Harik who spoke first. He said, with genuine confusion in his voice, "Izzy, what are you doing here?" Isadora picked up the pen beside the folder and clicked it once, a small, precise motion. "I own the company that's buying Ashworth," she said. "I've been the principal since 2021. Renwick is my acquisition coordinator." She glanced at Renwick briefly, then looked back at Clifford. "I assumed your due diligence would have surfaced this. I'm a little surprised it didn't." The room was very quiet. Clifford's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been anger, though it was hard to distinguish from embarrassment, because they looked very similar on him. "You?" he started. "The terms are the same as the offer accepted in March," Isadora said, in the same tone you might use to discuss a dentist appointment. "I didn't change anything when I found out you hadn't figured out who the buyer was. I could have, I didn't." She let that sentence sit for a moment. The employees keep their positions. The pension structure holds. The Burlington warehouse is being assessed for maintenance by a contractor next week, which should have been done 2 years ago. Clifford was staring at her. "By what right?" he said slowly, and then seemed to run out of words. Oswald cleared his throat and said gently that perhaps they should take a short recess. "No," Clifford said. "I want to know, by what right are you? This is a conflict of interest." "This is it isn't," Isadora said. "My counsel has reviewed it thoroughly. The numbered company was properly disclosed as a subsidiary of Meridian. You had 3 months and 2 rounds of due diligence to trace the ownership. The offer was fair. You accepted it." She looked at him steadily. "There is no conflict of interest in owning a company that buys another company," she said, "even when the other company belongs to your soon-to-be ex-husband." The last 4 words were said very quietly, and they landed exactly the way quiet things land when the room has been waiting for them. Harik said, under his breath, something that was probably not appropriate for a law office. Oswald put a document on the table and pointed to a section near the bottom. The junior associate at Isadora's end passed a set of papers to Clifford's side of the table. The financial analyst kept her eyes on her laptop. Renwick stood by the window and looked at his phone. Clifford sat down. He didn't seem to choose to sit down so much as the sitting down happened to him. He signed the documents that afternoon. He signed them because Oswald told him, quietly, the hallway during the recess he eventually asked for, that the offer was sound and the process had been clean, and that attempting to challenge it would cost more than the company was currently worth. He signed them because Harik, who was practical in the way that people are when they are watching someone else's pride cost them money, told him that being surprised was not the same as being wrong, and he signed them because somewhere underneath the shock and the humiliation there was a part of Clifford Ashworth that had always known Isadora was better at this than him, and had never known what to do with that knowledge. The story reached Josephine by the end of the day, a phone call from Harik, who could not keep it to himself. Josephine, who had spent 11 years managing her opinion of Isadora with the careful restraint of someone containing a large and inconvenient feeling, did not take the news gracefully. She called Clifford's phone 4 times between 6 and 8 o'clock that evening and left messages on 3 of them. Clifford did not call back. He called his lawyer the next morning and asked whether there was any mechanism by which the sale could be reversed. There was not. In October, Isadora closed the Ashworth acquisition formally, completed the first round of operational restructuring, and moved the company's billing systems to Meridian's shared platform. The Burlington warehouse repairs were finished by the end of the month. 2 of the deferred supplier contracts were renegotiated at better rates. The Ashworth name stayed on the division for the being, because it had goodwill in the market, and goodwill is not something you discard carelessly. She kept a small office in the Oakville building where the company had its Ontario hub. She went there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She made decisions about staffing and operations and long-term planning. She signed documents and reviewed forecasts, and took calls from clients who had no idea that the woman running the company they'd been doing business with for 23 years had also once spent her Sunday mornings making breakfast in a house 15 minutes down Lakeshore Road, while that company's former owner slept in. Tamzinka moved into that house in September. Josephine attended what was described, in a group text Isadora was no longer part of, as a welcome dinner. Isadora had dinner that same evening with Bridget and 2 friends from university at a restaurant in the Distillery District that she had been meaning to try for 2 years. She ordered the halibut and a glass of Viognier, and did not think about the group text at all, or if she did, only briefly, the way you think about weather that has already passed. It was Bridget who told her about the comment. Not that she was tracking comments, but because a mutual acquaintance had mentioned it. Apparently Josephine, in a Facebook post that had since been screenshotted by several people, had written that she hoped people would understand that her son had been manipulated by a woman with a hidden agenda, and that the sale of Ashworth Medical Supply had involved deception at the highest level. Isadora read this and was quiet for a moment. Then she forwarded it to Oswald and asked him to advise. Oswald's advice, 3 days later, was that Josephine might benefit from a friendly letter from a lawyer explaining the difference between deception and routine commercial confidentiality, and that the letter would probably accomplish more than any public response. The letter was sent. The Facebook post was deleted. Josephine did not reach out directly after that. There were things that Isadora thought about in the months after the signing, in the particular unguarded moments that arrive at the end of a working day when you've turned off your computer and you're waiting for the kettle to boil. She thought about the version of herself that had married Clifford, hopeful, practical, sure that love between two capable people was mostly a matter of shared effort and aligned values. She had not been naive exactly. She had just been wrong about some things in the way that everyone is wrong about some things. She thought about the years she had spent explaining herself in small ways, adjusting the pitch of her enthusiasm to avoid making him uncomfortable, talking about Meridian in simpler terms than the situation warranted, because she had learned the hard way that he responded better to simplicity. She had loved him, she thought. She had also learned to make herself smaller, gradually, the way you do when you live with someone whose self-perception doesn't have room for a partner who outgrows them. She didn't feel triumphant about the acquisition. That was what people didn't understand about it. The people who heard the story secondhand and arrived at it, looking for a clean narrative of revenge and satisfaction. It hadn't been revenge. It had been work. She had been building Meridian for years before any of this, and Ashworth Medical Supply had come across her desk the same way the other 4 companies had, because it matched the criteria, because the numbers made sense, because there was something salvageable underneath the damage. The fact that it was his company was something she had known about for months before the offer was made. She had sat with it, consulted her lawyer, confirmed there was no legal impediment, and made a business decision. If someone found poetry in that, she wasn't going to argue. But she hadn't done it to make a point. She had done it because it was good business. She thought about that sometimes, the difference between what actually happened and the story people told about it. The way the story people preferred required her to have been cleverer and angrier and more intentional than she had actually been. She had just done her job. What she told Bridget over wine one evening in November was simpler than any of the retrospective explanations she'd constructed in her head. She said, "I think I spent 10 years trying to be useful to his story. And somewhere in there, I forgot I was supposed to have one of my own." Bridget, who had heard a lot of stories in her career and knew which sentences would stay with a person, put down her glass and didn't say anything, which was the right response. Meridian Health Partners completed 3 more acquisitions in the following fiscal year. The Ashworth division was performing above projections by March, driven partly by the renegotiated contracts and partly by the maintenance improvements that had been deferred for 2 years under the previous management. Clifford Ashworth, 44, former owner of Ashworth Medical Supply, took a position in late November as a senior sales manager with a medical device distributor based in Brampton. He told people who asked that he had sold the family business by choice, that the market timing had been right, that he was enjoying the opportunity to apply his experience in a new direction. Most people were polite enough not to ask follow-up questions. Josephine, 69, continued to live in Burlington. She attended her church and her garden club and mentioned her son's new role to everyone she could find a reason to mention it to. She did not mention ex-wife. Tamsin Keir moved out of the Oakville house in January for reasons that were not widely discussed and relocated to a condo in Etobicoke. And Isadora Crane, 38 years old, founder and principal of Meridian Health Partners, former wife of a man who had not understood what he had until it was no longer his, sat at the head of a conference table on a Tuesday morning in February and reviewed the term sheet for what would be Meridian's 8th acquisition, a medical logistics company based in Guelph with good bones and poor cash management. The document in front of her was 50 pages long. She picked up her pen and started at the beginning.